Yeah, we do, Boris. We just got the ruling. It is 92 pages long, and I'm scanning through it right now. But when I'm looking at these numbers, the totals that the judge is ordering collectively in the case, so this will include all of the defendants, I'm getting a total of $362 million. And I'm just scrolling through this now. I can see that there's the dollar amount specific to Donald Trump. I'm going to use a calculator to do some rough math. It gets us to, for Donald Trump, about $354 million. That's for him, the company, the Trump Organization. So very close to what the New York Attorney General's office was seeking of $370 million. There's a lot of a lot of zeros here and a lot of other numbers, but roughly $354 million is the judgment against Donald Trump. The judge also found that his son, Eric Trump, is liable in the amount of $4 million. Donald Trump Jr. is liable in the amount of $4 million. And Alan Weisselberg, the former chief financial officer, is liable in the amount of $1 million.
All right, everyone. John here. So this is happening right now. A judge formally ruled that Trump's financial records shock the conscience, finding decades of systematic fraud in how he inflated his net worth. The spin has been relentless, but the legal reality is that a court has officially declared his business empire was built on deception. Let me paint you a picture of what actually went down in that Manhattan courtroom, because the details matter more than you might think. This wasn't some rushed political hit job cooked up overnight. This was years of investigation, years of subpoenas, years of financial experts poring over documents, years of depositions and testimony. New York Attorney General Letitia James didn't wake up one morning and decide to go after Trump. She started digging into the Trump Organization all the way back when the world was a very different place, when the idea of a president facing this kind of legal scrutiny seemed almost unimaginable.
I haven't had a chance to read through the language of what the judge said here, but really this was about the money, because the judge had already found that Donald Trump, his sons, and Alan Weisselberg had engaged in fraud by issuing fraudulent financial statements, giving them to banks and insurers in order to obtain favorable rates. He ruled that before the trial, but we did go through a 3-month trial. The judge was looking to determine how much in ill-gotten gains, is what this word of disgorgement means, the money that they benefited from. So now the judge issuing the significant ruling, more than $350 million against Donald Trump and the Trump Organization, and against the sons. Now, I'm going to just see if I can quickly search to see what the judge said about any ban. That was the other outstanding question here. I'm not able to find that very quickly, but that is another issue that we're looking for here, of what the judge says about whether he's banning Trump from doing business or his sons. But this ruling, there was a question of whether the sons would be found to be liable, because the judge said at the end of the trial, during closing arguments, he asked the Attorney General's team.
But she kept digging, and what she found was a decade-long pattern of deception that would make any honest business person's jaw drop. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This wasn't some accountant messing up a single spreadsheet on a bad day. This was a systematic, coordinated effort to pump up property values, inflate net worth, and present a financial picture to lenders that bore almost no relation to reality. The scale of what we're talking about is genuinely staggering once you actually look at the numbers. Take Mar-a-Lago, Trump's fancy Florida club, the one he likes to call the Winter White House, the one where members pay something like $200,000 just to walk through the doors. A judge found that Trump inflated the value of that property by roughly 2,300% in one financial statement. Let me put that in terms that everyone can understand.
He said he wasn't sure there was sufficient evidence against the sons. This ruling here indicating that he believes that they did at least receive improper profits, and asking them to disgorge that as a result of this case. This is a significant win for the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. She'd been investigating this case ever since Michael Cohen testified before Congress, when he made this first allegation that Trump had inflated the value of properties to get better rates on loans and insurance, and to pay less in taxes. So she is now justified by this finding by the judge. And again, this was a judge trial. This was not a jury trial. So we've been waiting for Judge Arthur Engorn to issue this ruling. And now we have it. We still have to continue to read through it. Our team is doing that as I speak. But, a real significant win for the New York Attorney General, and a loss for Donald Trump in this case that goes to the heart of his reputation, the reputation that he was a successful real estate businessman businessman that he rode to the White House. The judge finding here that, there was fraud, there was liability, and saying that Trump needs to pay back more than $350 million. Boris Brianna?
If your house is actually worth $100,000 and you tell the bank it's worth $2.3 million, you are committing fraud. There's no other way to describe it. There's no gray area. There's no reasonable disagreement. You are lying to a financial institution to get better terms, and that is illegal. And Mar-a-Lago was just the beginning. It wasn't just one property that got the Trump treatment. It was Trump Tower. It was 40 Wall Street. It was golf courses scattered across the country, each one valued at numbers that bore little resemblance to what they were actually worth. It was the cash Trump claimed to have on hand, inflated to make him look more liquid, more capable of handling massive deals. His own apartment in Trump Tower was valued at something like 3 times its actual worth.
Goes so much to his identity. This is clearly one of the cases, one of the legal issues that he's facing that bothers him the most here, as the Attorney General in New York had argued that it was the marketplace that was harmed here and was seeking to recoup this disgorgement or these ill-gotten gains. Let's go ahead and bring in Paula Reed, our chief legal correspondent, to talk about what she is seeing here, with our understanding here, Paula, that this is really kind of hot off the presses, this ruling.
Yes, the paper is still warm, but we're going through it right now. And as you and Kara were talking about, this case is so personal because it represents such a threat to Trump's business, his family business, and his identity. Remember, it was his identity as a businessman that brought him fame before he arrived at the White House. But in looking at the summary of this ruling, we see, in addition to the monetary penalties that Kara just laid out, they have found him liable for fraud, and they are going to continue the appointment of an independent monitor. So back in 2022,
property after property, year after year, a decade of this pattern continuing without interruption. The investigation that uncovered all of this wasn't some slapdash affair either. Attorney General James started looking into the Trump Organization years before a single lawsuit was filed. Her team issued subpoenas, took depositions, and reviewed financial records that went back more than a decade. They weren't looking for a quick headline. They were building a case, and they were building it carefully. When they finally filed their lawsuit, they had enough evidence to fill a room. And when the case went to trial, it wasn't a jury that heard it. It was a bench trial, meaning a single judge would decide everything based solely on the evidence presented. That judge was Arthur Engoron, and he did not mince words about what he saw. Judge Engoron looked at Trump's financial statements, looked at the property valuations.
The judge installed a monitor to keep an eye on exactly what the Trump Organization was doing when it came to its business dealings. Now, among the things this monitor uncovered were a $48 million loan, for example, to the company itself, but there was no paperwork. They couldn't really find any information. That was just one thing that came up. Now, Trump lawyers have insisted, because they loaned the money to themselves, they didn't have the paperwork that they needed, and insist that the monitor has found no fraud. Now, the judge also here orders the installation of an independent director of compliance. But I also want to note that they are saying here, the judge is saying that they're going to limit the defendant's right to conduct business in New York for a few years. Now, it's probably going to take a few minutes before we unpack exactly what that means. That does not appear to be an indefinite ban, the so-called corporate death penalty, but it does appear that the judge is going to put some restrictions on Trump and the Trump Organization's ability to do business in the state of New York. But let's go back to the idea of this independent director of compliance. That appears to be maybe an executive level person who will ensure that they are being honest when evaluating their assets, when applying for insurance or loans from banks. Because, of course,
looked at the pattern of deception that stretched across years, and he made a series of findings that would shake the foundation of Trump's entire business empire. He found that Trump's credibility was severely compromised, meaning he couldn't be trusted to tell the truth under oath. He found that Trump showed a complete lack of contrition and remorse, meaning he wasn't sorry and would almost certainly do it again if given the chance. And then he hit Trump with a penalty that would make anyone's head spin. The total came to more than $450 million across all defendants, including Trump's sons Donald Jr. and Eric, who each got hit with $4 million penalties of their own. Trump himself was banned from serving as an officer or director of any New York company for 3 years. He was blocked from seeking loans from New York-based financial institutions. An independent monitor was placed over the Trump Organization to watch how they do business going forward. The most famous businessman in America was told, in no uncertain terms, that he couldn't do business here anymore. Not like this, not anymore. Now, this is where the story gets complicated, and it's also where most people check out. They hear that an appeals court threw out the fine, and they immediately conclude that Trump won, that the case is over, that nothing really happened, but that conclusion is dead wrong, and it's exactly what Trump wants you to think. He called it a total victory on social media, all caps, classic Trump move. But let me ask you something really simple. If you go to court and a judge finds you committed fraud, and then a higher court says the punishment was too big, but you still committed the fraud, is that a win? Think about it. That's like getting caught shoplifting, and the store agrees not to make you pay back every dollar you stole. But the security footage still exists. The record still exists. The store manager still said it happened. That label does not come off just because the penalty got knocked down. The appeals court that threw out the fine did not throw out the fraud finding. They looked at everything, and they said yes, Trump and his company and his sons were liable for fraud. That part stands. That part stays. That is now part of the permanent legal record of Donald J. Trump. So Trump is out here dancing like he beat the whole case when multiple courts have looked at his books and said this is fraud. And the scale of what he was doing is almost unbelievable. In some years, Trump inflated his net worth by anywhere from $812 million to $2.2 billion. Not million, billion. Billions of dollars in exaggeration spread across financial statements that were submitted to lenders to get better loan terms. The judge who presided over the whole thing called it fraud that leaps off the page. He wasn't confused or uncertain. He was clear, direct, and thorough. And the evidence he based that on came from years of painstaking work that uncovered a pattern that Trump had been maintaining for more than a decade. The spin on this case has been so thick and so aggressive that most people on both sides don't actually know what happened. They know the headline, they don't know the story, and that's exactly how Trump wants it. But let's slow down and break this thing apart piece by piece, because there are layers here that most people glide right over. If you don't understand those layers, you're going to get played by the spin. And make no mistake, both sides spin this, but there's spin and then there's flat out ignoring what the courts actually said. Those are two very different things. Trump's big defense throughout the entire case was a fascinating exercise in legal gymnastics. He basically argued that sure, maybe we told the banks our properties were worth more than they actually were, but the banks are sophisticated lenders. They do their own research, they make their own calculations, and they didn't blindly trust our numbers. And besides, nobody got hurt in the end, so what's the problem? It sounds almost reasonable until you actually think it through. You cannot go into a bank and lie on your financial statements. And then, when you get caught, say the bank should have checked my numbers more carefully. That's not how the law works. The entire point of submitting financial statements to a lender is that the lender is supposed to rely on what you give them. They use your numbers to calculate risk, to decide how much to lend and at what rate. You can't inflate your net worth by billions of dollars, get better loan terms based on those inflated numbers, and then shrug and say they should have verified everything better. That's not a defense. That's a confession with extra steps. Judge Engoron saw right through that argument. He rejected it entirely, called the whole thing fraud, and wrote that the scheme leaps off the page. And the evidence he based that on didn't come from thin air. It came from years of work by James and her team, who had reviewed records going back well over a decade. When the trial finally happened, it stretched across 11 weeks, with witness after witness taking the stand and document after document being introduced into evidence. The judge found that Trump inflated his assets by billions of dollars on his financial statements year after year after year. These weren't small rounding errors. These weren't minor adjustments that reasonable people might disagree about. These were massive, systematic exaggerations that represented enormous gaps between what the document said and what the properties were actually worth. Take the Mar-a-Lago situation, which I need you to really understand because it illustrates the audacity of what Trump was doing. Under the actual terms of the deed for Mar-a-Lago, the property is legally restricted. It can only be used as a private club. It cannot be developed for residential real estate. It cannot be turned into luxury condos or apartments or housing. The deed says so. So when Trump's financial statements value Mar-a-Lago as if someone could buy it and develop it into high-end residential real estate, he was valuing it based on a use that was legally impossible. A court found that the way Mar-a-Lago was valued violated the terms of Trump's own deed. He was essentially pretending the property could be used in a way that it explicitly could not be used, just to pump up the numbers. And that was just one property among many. Trump Tower's triplex apartment was valued at about 3 times its actual worth. Golf courses were inflated well beyond their market value. Cash on hand was listed higher than it actually was. It was a pattern that repeated itself across the entire Trump organization, and it had been going on for years. When you add it all up, the judge concluded that Trump inflated his net worth anywhere from $812 million to $2.2 billion, depending on which year you look at. Billions, not millions, billions. And all of that was happening while Trump was presenting himself to the world as the ultimate business genius, the guy who never loses, the guy who always wins. Fast forward to the appeals court decision, and this is where things get really interesting. The appeals court issued a massive opinion that ran hundreds of pages, divided and complicated with concurring opinions and dissenting opinions flying all over the place. But here's the thing that is absolutely critical for you to understand. Every single judge on that court agreed that Trump committed fraud. Every one of them, even the ones who disagreed about other things, even the dissenting judges. The fraud finding was unanimous across the entire panel. What they disagreed about was the punishment. The majority said $500 million is constitutionally excessive. It violates the 8th Amendment, so they threw out the financial disgorgement. Gone. And Trump's team immediately exploded into celebration. Total victory, he said. His former lawyer jumped on social media. His sons were celebrating. His supporters were everywhere with the news. But here's what they quietly left out of the victory lap. The bans are still in place. Trump is still banned from serving as an officer or director of New York companies. The Trump Organization still has an independent compliance monitor watching everything they do. The restrictions on seeking loans from New York financial institutions are still there. The fraud label has been confirmed permanent on the record. Letitia James's office came out and said yet another court has determined that the president broke the law, and she's right. The appeals court that cut his penalties still confirmed his fraud. And the fine, while thrown out, was never the most important part of the case anyway. The fraud finding was always the real prize, and that prize belongs to James and her team. Now, heading into the current moment, Trump's lawyers have filed a massive brief with New York's highest court, asking them to throw out the entire remaining judgment. Not just the fine, which is already gone, but everything. The bans, the monitors, the restrictions, the whole structure of remaining consequences. They're arguing that James never had the authority to bring the case in the first place, which is a fascinating legal argument given that the case has already been through trial and one level of appeal. At the same time, the Justice Department under Trump's own administration has opened an investigation into Letitia James. They subpoenaed her for records. They're looking into whether she violated Trump's civil rights by bringing this lawsuit. So let me make sure you're following what is happening here. The President of the United States is using his own Justice Department to investigate the state attorney general who took him to court, got a fraud finding against him at trial, and had that fraud confirmed on appeal, while his personal lawyers simultaneously fight to erase the remaining consequences in a higher court. Think about that from a pure power dynamic standpoint. A sitting president with the full weight of the federal government at his disposal, using that weight to fight a state civil fraud case. That tells you everything about how much this case still matters to him, how much it still stings, how much the fraud label still hurts. And I'm going to be real about the politics of this, because a significant chunk of Trump supporters genuinely do not care what any court finds. The polling has been incredibly consistent on this. When Trump's legal cases came up, when charges were filed, when verdicts came down, a huge portion of Republicans rallied closer to him, not further away. One survey found that about 40% of Republicans said Trump's legal charges actually made them more likely to support him. More likely, not less likely. That's the loyalty dynamic, and Trump knows it better than anyone. That's why he calls everything a witch hunt, why he attacks the prosecutors personally, why he makes the story about political persecution rather than about what 10 years of financial records actually showed. But courts don't care about narratives. Courts care about evidence, and multiple levels of New York courts went through that evidence, came back with the same answer, and put it in writing. He committed fraud. The fine is gone, but the finding isn't. And that brings us to the core of why this all matters and what comes next, because there's a lot to unpack here, and I want to make sure none of it gets lost in the noise. First, the fraud label is permanent, and no amount of spin changes that. Here is what people keep skipping over in all the noise about the fine being thrown out. The fraud finding is still there. It was confirmed at trial, it was confirmed on appeal. It is part of the permanent legal record of Donald J. Trump. And even if Trump's current appeal to New York's highest court somehow succeeds, even if they throw out every remaining ban and every remaining business restriction, the record of what Judge Engoron found during that 11-week trial will still exist forever. The transcripts will still exist. The evidence of inflated assets will still be on file. The 2,300% Mar-a-Lago valuation, the inflated triplex, the billions in overstated net worth, the judge's finding that the fraud shocked the conscience. You cannot unring that bell. And here's why that matters so deeply. Not just legally, but politically and practically. Trump's entire brand is built on the idea that he's a genius businessman, not just a successful one. The best, the greatest, the most brilliant deal maker in history. His whole political identity, his whole argument for why people should trust him with the economy, with trade deals, with foreign negotiations, with running the country, it all rests on this image of being an unstoppable business force. And now there is a permanent courthouse document confirmed by multiple courts that says a judge looked at how he built that empire and found that parts of it were built on fraud, on inflated numbers, on misrepresentations to banks, on telling lenders he was worth billions more than the evidence supported. That is a direct hit on the brand. A court found in writing that the genius was at least partially constructed on lies. Now, here's the thing about Trump's base and why they might say this doesn't matter. They'll say the banks got paid back, they'll say nobody was hurt, they'll say it was legal puffery and everyone in real estate does it. And look, some of them genuinely believe that. But here's where that argument falls apart. Trump didn't inflate his numbers by a few percent. He inflated his net worth by up to $2.2 billion in some years. That is not rounding. That is not puffery. That is, according to multiple New York courts, fraud. And the banks were not simply forgiving the whole thing because nobody got hurt. Deutsche Bank, one of Trump's biggest lenders, actually ended its relationship with the Trump Organization years before this case even got to trial. The banks knew something was off, and the courts confirmed what it was. So the idea that this was all harmless deal-making, that everybody in real estate does, that argument doesn't survive contact with the actual record. The record that is now permanent. The record that multiple judges have confirmed. The record that no amount of spin on social media is going to erase. Second, the business bans still sting, and Trump is spending millions to fight them. Even with the fine completely gone, Trump is still spending enormous resources fighting to remove the remaining bans. The ban on him and his sons serving as officers of New York companies, the independent compliance monitor watching the Trump Organization, the loan restrictions with New York financial institutions. And I want you to ask yourself a simple question. Why? If you truly totally won, if this was a complete victory, if the case was completely fake and politically motivated and had no merit, why would you spend millions of dollars filing a massive brief with New York's highest court to erase what's left of it? Because if you truly won, you walk away, you move on. You don't spend years and millions of dollars trying to erase a case you already beat. The answer is obvious. The compliance monitor means someone with real legal authority is watching how the Trump Organization does business going forward. After 10 years of inflating numbers, having someone watching how you value assets is uncomfortable. The loan restrictions mean reduced access to the biggest financial market in the world. Manhattan is the center of global real estate finance. For a real estate empire built on financing, being restricted from that market matters a lot. You don't fight this hard for this long with this many pages against something that doesn't matter. Third, he's using presidential power to tilt the playing field. Let's just call it what it is. The Justice Department opening an investigation into Letitia James. At the same time, Trump's lawyers are fighting the remaining judgment in court is not a coincidence. It is a coordinated pressure campaign. James's own attorney called it the most blatant and desperate example of this administration carrying out political retribution. And whether you agree with that framing or not, the timing is impossible to ignore. Think about what this does strategically. If you're the opposing attorney in a major legal fight and suddenly the federal government is investigating you personally, you now have two fights to deal with instead of one. You have to respond to the federal subpoena, you have to spend time and resources on your own defense, your attention is divided, your energy is split. And in the court of public opinion, which matters in politics, even when it doesn't matter in court, it muddies the water. Because now every news story about the fraud case has to also mention the DOJ investigating James. And suddenly, it's not a clean story about courts finding Trump committed fraud. Suddenly, it's, well, both sides are doing stuff, which is a much better place for Trump to be. But here's the reality check that never changes. The DOJ investigating James does not change what happened at trial. It does not change what Judge Engoron found. It does not change what the appellate division confirmed. The evidence is the evidence. Courts looked at Trump's books and found fraud, period. Fourth, what happens next matters a lot. New York's Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, is now sitting with Trump's current appeal. They have to decide whether to throw out the remaining judgment entirely, the bans, the monitors, the restrictions, or let them stand. If they side with Trump and toss everything, his team will call it the greatest legal victory in American history. They will argue the entire case was a sham, that Letitia James had no authority, that the whole thing was political. They'll try to retroactively rewrite the story in public consciousness. If they side with James and keep the bans in place, Trump will call it the greatest witch hunt in American history. He will attack the court. He will attack the judges by name. He will post in all caps on Truth Social. He will use it as a rallying cry. Either way, he's got a spin ready. That's how this works. He always has a spin ready. But here's the thing that does not change no matter what that court decides. The trial happened. 11 weeks. Evidence laid out in a Manhattan courthouse for all to see. The judge found fraud. The appeals court confirmed fraud. That is now part of the historical record. Future journalists will cite it. Future biographers will write about it. Future businesses dealing with the Trump Organization may look it up. The fine is gone, but the finding lives, and it will keep living. Now let's zoom all the way out. We have a sitting president of the United States right now who has an active civil fraud finding against him from multiple courts, who is simultaneously fighting to erase the remaining consequences of that finding, who is using his own Justice Department to investigate the state attorney general who got that finding, who is filing massive briefs in state court while running the country. The billion-dollar businessman brand he has spent his entire adult life building now has a permanent legal asterisk sitting right next to it. He says the banks were happy, the courts found fraud, he says the cases are fake, multiple judges confirmed the findings. He says total victory, the fraud label is still there on the permanent record. He says witch hunt, the transcripts still exist. The evidence still exists. The property valuations are still on file. The spin doesn't change the receipts. It never does. What Letitia James did, what Judge Engoron confirmed, and what the appellate division upheld was expose something that Trump has spent his whole career carefully managing: the perception of his wealth, his success, his business genius, the whole image. And courts found in painstaking, documented 11-week trial detail that the image was at least partially built on something other than reality. So the next time someone tells you Trump totally beat the fraud case, you know exactly what to say. Tell them to pay attention to what the courts actually said versus what Trump says the courts said. Because those are two very different things. The fine is gone, the fraud is forever. And here's what I'll leave you with. This case is only one piece of a much bigger story. When you start connecting the dots between this fraud case, the business bans, the DOJ going after James, and the broader pattern of how Trump uses presidential power to fight his legal battles, you start to see something really significant taking shape. The full picture of how Trump has weaponized the presidency to fight every legal consequence he's ever faced is a story that goes way deeper than one court case in New York, and that is exactly what we're getting into in the next video. Don't miss it. Stay tuned.